Thank you for coming. Thank you to the organizers for the invitation. Okay, globalization. I've been asked to talk about globalization and what can we do about it. Globalization is not a theoretical concept. Just now, only yesterday, Olaf Scholz announced a huge 65 billion package to assist the average German family or individual. These are all the pains that we all feel as a result of the crisis of globalization. Now, this is not recent. The crisis of globalization has begun at least back in 2008 with the global financial crisis. Globalization is facing today a major challenge from a new Cold War that Donald Trump began against China. President Biden continued, and then of course Vladimir Putin came in, all guns blazing literally, with a cruel and hideous invasion of Ukraine. But the pains that I was referring to began in 2008, at least in 2008, and they were exacerbated by monumental errors on behalf of central bankers on the one hand and politicians like myself on the other. But before we start thinking of what needs to be done, because if we can't think of what needs to be done, everything else is just abstract, irrelevant, useless theory. Before we start talking about what needs to be done, allow me to say that the thing that frustrates me about discussions regarding globalization is that we are missing the point about globalization. Most people immediately, when they hear the word globalization, they think supply chains and trade. Well, it's not right to make this identification of globalization with intensified trade. Why? Because there are two separate realms. One is intensified trade. And personally, I think that intensified trade and strong supply chains connecting the various nodes of production and distribution, this is a good thing for humanity. And I don't believe that critics of globalization should be criticizing trade. The other aspect of globalization is the problematic one, and that's finance. The freewheeling, unfettered globalization of finance. That is what created the pains of 2008. That is what is giving globalization a bad name. That is what is creating all the ripple effects that are damaging significantly the lives of the majority out there, both in the global north and in the global south. So we should separate the two. And I think that, critics of globalization should beware the end of globalization. Because what we are referring to as relocalization, in the form of diminished trade and the return to our own shores of production facilities and so on from China, from Vietnam, from here, there, and everywhere. Is this going to serve the interests of the majorities in our countries, in the developing world? I don't believe so. You see, the anti-globalizers are making the same mistake that the pro-globalizers make. They are identifying globalization with trade. And that is a huge error. I want to say it once more. I hope you forgive my repetition. Why is this? Come to think of it, between 2008 and last year, globalization of finance in particular, the freewheeling flow of financial capital, seriously depressed inflation to the extent of turning it negative, with negative interest rates in many parts of the world, poisoning money and giving you negative interest rates that almost destroyed your banking system and your pension funds and your insurance companies in this country, in Germany. So the period period of supposed growth between 2008 and 2009 and 2021 to 2022 was a period during which the globalization of finance was exporting more deflationary forces in a world that was suffering from deflation. And what will a relocalization do now, or deglobalization, if it means less trade internationally and relocalization of production? That will create more inflationary forces in an inflationary environment. So anyone who thinks that globalization is a bad thing and deglobalization is a good thing, well, they have got it wrong, because they are conflating in their minds the globalization of finance with intensification of trade. Which leads me, because I've been asked in this talk to come up with calls for action. That is, not simply to analyze what's wrong with the world, but to come up with ideas, suggestions. So, suggestion number one, which emanates from everything I've said so far. Suggestion number one is that we deglobalize finance. We create new controls for the freewheeling flows of financial capital while intensifying, not diminishing, international trade. And take trade deals. If you look at every trade deal, TPP and so on, they have very little to do with trade. This is one of the paradoxes of trade deals. It's all about IP, property rights. It's about demolishing the democratic sovereignty of our developed countries, of underdeveloped countries, by replacing the courts and the parliaments with arbitration tribunals that effectively are controlled by financial capital or by large corporations. How about trade deals that deal with trade, that facilitate trade, and separate services from goods, separate IP tribunals from trade? That's my first suggestion, and I'm very much looking forward, if you care to do this, to have this conversation with me at the end of my 30 minutes. Secondly, the second point I want to make, let me warn you in advance, I'll make 4 points. I've made the first one. There will be 3 more points coming. 3 analyses followed by a call for action. Now, there is a lot of discussion about globalization 3.0, 4.0, 5.0, a rebooting of globalization. What concerns me about all these discussions is that we are not taking seriously the most important aspect of the initial globalization drive following the collapse of Bretton Woods in the 1970s. Globalization 1.0 had one characteristic that very few people talk about. And unless we address that one characteristic of globalization 1.0, there is no point in talking about rebooting globalization. And what's that one characteristic? It is that it was founded on permanent global imbalances. What do I mean by this? Recall the first post-war phase, 1950 to 1972, the end of Bretton Woods. The golden age of capitalism. Remember, the 1950s and 1960s, when we had, under the Bretton Woods system, we had the most sustained period of growth with low inflation, fixed exchange rates, and interest rates that were almost fixed at 4%. It was a remarkable period.